Every satisfying downfall begins the same way. A man standing at the height of his power, so certain of his dominion that he mistakes silence for submission, obedience for devotion, and control for love. Duke Caedric Vale of Blackthorne ruled the northern territories the way winter rules the earth, not through argument, through inevitability. And on the night he signed the decree that would erase his wife from the Vale bloodline forever, he believed he was correcting a mistake. He did not yet understand that the only mistake worth correcting had been his own. Stay until the end. This one bleeds differently than you expect. Storm clouds consumed the sky above Blackthorne Keep like something starving. Lightning fractured the horizon in pale, surgical lines, while rain hammered the stone parapets hard enough to strip moss from the crenellations. Somewhere in the eastern wing, servants moved through corridors lit by dying candelabras, their footsteps quick and deliberate, the practiced choreography of a household that had learned to function beneath the gravitational pull of one man's silence. Duke Caedric Vale stood in his private study on the third floor, his back to the fireplace, reading dispatches from Parliament with the focused indifference of a man who already knew what they contained. He was 34 years old, tall enough that door frames required minor architectural consideration, built with the kind of lean muscularity that came not from vanity, but from a lifetime of horseback riding through terrain that broke lesser men before breakfast. His jaw carried the sharp geometry of old aristocratic bloodlines, and his eyes held the flat gray stillness of a frozen lake, the kind of surface that reflected everything and revealed nothing. He finished the third dispatch, folded it with mechanical precision, and placed it on the mahogany desk beside a crystal glass of untouched brandy. The fire crackled. Rain screamed against the windows. The grandfather clock in the far corner measured time the way Caedric measured people, with absolute indifference to their comfort. His valet, Renwick, entered without knocking. Only 3 people in the known world possessed that privilege, and 2 of them were dead. "The solicitors have arrived, Your Grace." "How many?" "3. As you instructed." Caedric adjusted the cuff of his left sleeve without looking up. "And the Duchess?" Renwick hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but Caedric caught it the way a predator catches the scent of blood shifting on the wind. "She is in the drawing room, Your Grace. She has been there since this morning." "Alone?" "Yes, sir." Caedric said nothing for a long moment. The fire threw restless shadows across his face, carving hollows beneath his cheekbones that made him look older than his years. Then he reached for the brandy, drank it in a single swallow, and set the glass down with the decisive finality of a gavel striking wood. "Send them to the library. I will address her first." Renwick bowed and disappeared into the corridor, like smoke retreating from an open window. Caedric stood motionless for another 30 seconds. Not because he was uncertain. Caedric Vale had not experienced genuine uncertainty since the age of 11, when his father had dragged him into the frozen courtyard of Blackthorne and forced him to watch a stable hand flogged for stealing grain. The boy had cried. The Duke had backhanded him hard enough to split his lip, and in that single act of violence, young Caedric had learned the foundational lesson of his existence. Sentiment was a luxury, and luxury, in the Vale bloodline, was always someone else's weakness to exploit. He crossed the study, descended 2 flights of stairs without acknowledging the servants who pressed themselves against the walls as he passed, and pushed open the double doors of the west drawing room. Seraphina was standing by the cathedral windows. Of course she was. 3 years of marriage, and the woman had developed an almost gravitational relationship with those windows. She stood there during storms, during silence, during the long, hollow evenings when the keep settled into the particular brand of quiet that only ancient stone could produce, as if she were waiting for something beyond the glass that the walls could never provide. She turned when the doors opened, not quickly, not with the startled urgency of a woman caught off guard. She turned the way someone turns when they have already rehearsed this moment 100 times inside their own mind and have simply been waiting for reality to catch up. She was 26, dark auburn hair pinned severely away from a face that photographers would have called classical and painters would have called tragic, high cheekbones, a mouth that curved downward at the corners even when she smiled, as though her body understood truths her manners refused to admit. Her eyes were the deep amber of aged whiskey, warm in theory, but layered with the kind of stillness that develops in women who have learned to survive by becoming invisible. She wore pale gray. She always wore pale gray now. In the early months of their marriage, she had worn emerald green and midnight blue, colors that announced presence, that demanded acknowledgement. Somewhere between the first year and the second, the colors had faded. Caedric had never noticed. Or rather, he had noticed and filed the observation in the same mental drawer where he stored information about weather patterns and quarterly estate revenues. Useful data, nothing more. "Caedric," she said. "Not your grace. Not my lord. Just his name, stripped bare, offered without ornamentation. It was the only rebellion she had left, and they both knew it." "Sit down, Seraphina. I would prefer to stand. I was not asking." She held his gaze for 2 full seconds. Then she sat in the wingback chair nearest the window, her hands folded in her lap with the deliberate composure of a woman holding herself together at the seams. Caedric remained standing. He always remained standing during conversations that mattered. Height was architecture, and architecture was power. "I have made a decision regarding our arrangement," he said. His voice carried the same temperature as the rain outside. Controlled, clinical, stripped of everything except function. 3 years have passed since our union was formalized. The expectation was clear from the beginning. An heir, a continuation of the Vale bloodline. You have failed to fulfill that obligation. He paused. Not for dramatic effect. Caedric did not traffic in drama. He paused because precision required space between statements, the way a surgeon requires space between incisions. "I am dissolving this marriage." The words entered the room like a blade entering flesh, clean, almost painless in the initial moment. The real damage would come later when the wound had time to understand itself. Seraphina did not move, did not blink, did not breathe in any way that was visible to the naked eye. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded, her amber eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond Caedric's left shoulder, as if she were studying something painted on the wall behind him that only she could see. "On what grounds?" she asked. Her voice was steady, terrifyingly steady. "Failure to produce an heir constitutes a breach of the marital contract's foundational clause. The solicitors have reviewed the documentation. The dissolution will be clean, efficient. You will retain a small annual stipend and accommodation at Harrowfield until alternative arrangements can be made." Harrowfield. She repeated the word as if testing its weight. Harrowfield was a crumbling estate 40 miles south of Blackthorne, tucked into a river valley that flooded every spring. It was where the Vale family sent things they wanted to forget. "It is adequate." "For what?" "For someone in your position." The silence that followed was not empty. It was pressurized. The kind of silence that precedes detonation in mines. The kind that fills the space between a pulled trigger and the bullet's arrival. Seraphina looked at him then. Not past him. Not through him. At him. And for a fraction of a second, something moved behind her eyes that Caedric had never seen before. Not sadness. Not anger. Something older than both. Something that looked uncomfortably like recognition. "You genuinely believe this is about an heir," she said quietly. "That is what you have told yourself. That this is practical, strategic, the rational correction of a failed investment." "It is precisely that." "No." Her voice dropped half an octave. "This is about the fact that you cannot control something you refuse to understand. You married a woman expecting a function, and when that function proved insufficient to fill the silence in this house, you decided the woman was the problem, not the silence." Caedric's jaw tightened. It was the smallest possible physical response, a millimeter of tension along the mandibular line, but Seraphina caught it. She had spent 3 years learning to read the micro-expressions of a man who communicated primarily through absence. "Your emotional interpretation of a legal proceeding is precisely the kind of sentimentality that has no place in this discussion," he said. "Is that what you told yourself when you stopped coming to my chambers? That it was legal, strategic?" "I stopped because continuing served no productive purpose." "You stopped because being near me made you feel something you could not categorize, and anything Caedric Vale cannot categorize, Caedric Vale destroys." The fire popped. A log shifted, sending a shower of sparks against the iron grate. Outside, thunder rolled across the moors like artillery. Caedric crossed to the writing desk, picked up a leather-bound folder, and held it toward her. "The documents require your signature, page 4 and page 11. Seraphina stared at the folder. Then she stood. She moved with a slowness that was almost ceremonial, rising from the chair the way a condemned prisoner rises when the verdict has been read. She crossed the 3 feet of Persian carpet between them, took the folder from his hand, and opened it. She read every page, all 14 of them. While Caedric stood motionless and the storm raged beyond the windows and the fire consumed itself in the grate. She read the clauses about property division with the same measured attention she gave the clauses about public reputation management. She read the section titled Forfeiture of Household Rights and the subsection titled Relinquishment of the Vale Name, and the final paragraph that reduced 3 years of marriage to a series of financial transactions executed with the emotional warmth of a livestock auction. Then she signed. Page 4. Page 11. She placed the folder on the desk, looked at Caedric one final time, and said the only words that would haunt him for the next 6 months of his life. "You will remember this moment, Caedric. Not because you lost me. You never had me. You will remember it, because this is the exact second you chose to be your father. And unlike him, you will live long enough to understand what that costs." She walked out of the drawing room without closing the doors behind her. Caedric stood alone in the firelight, his hand resting on the signed documents, his expression unreadable. The grandfather clock measured another minute, then another. The storm battered the keep with renewed fury, as if the weather itself had taken offense. He told himself he felt nothing. He told himself that 3 times before he believed it. The household mobilized with surgical efficiency. Within 48 hours, every trace of Seraphina Vale was systematically removed from Blackthorne Keep. Her wardrobe was packed into trunks by servants who refused to meet each other's eyes. Her books were boxed and labeled for storage. The portrait that had hung in the Eastern Gallery since their wedding was taken down and carried to the attic, leaving a rectangular ghost on the wall where the paint was slightly darker, a wound the house would carry like a scar. Renwick supervised the operation with the grim professionalism of a man dismantling a crime scene. He had served the Vale family for 23 years. He had watched Caedric's mother leave Blackthorne under similar circumstances when the boy was 9. He had watched the previous Duke drink himself into cardiac failure by 51. And now he watched the cycle begin again with the mechanical inevitability of seasons turning. He said nothing. Renwick always said nothing. That was why he had survived. On the morning of Seraphina's departure, the rain had stopped. The sky hung low and colorless over Blackthorne, a flat sheet of pewter that leached warmth from every surface it touched. Servants lined the courtyard in silence, not as a farewell, as witnesses. The aristocratic machine required documentation of its own cruelty, and human eyes were the oldest recording devices available. Seraphina descended the main staircase carrying nothing except a small leather trunk and a woolen traveling cloak the color of wet stone. Her hair was unpinned for the first time anyone could remember, falling in dark waves past her shoulders, and the effect was startling. She looked younger, rawer, like a woman who had shed a costume she had been wearing for 3 years and was finally showing her actual face. The carriage waited at the base of the courtyard steps. A single driver, no escort, no coat of arms painted on the doors. The Duke had arranged transportation the way he arranged everything, functionally, without excess, without the kind of consideration that might suggest he cared about the comfort of the woman inside. Seraphina paused at the bottom of the steps. She did not look back at the keep. She did not scan the windows for the silhouette of a man watching from above. She knew he was there. 3rd floor. Study window. Standing behind the curtain with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the expression he wore when conducting particularly difficult negotiations with Parliament. She knew because she had spent 3 years memorizing every pattern of avoidance he possessed. She climbed into the carriage. The driver snapped the reins, the wheels groaned against wet cobblestones, and Blackthorne Keep swallowed the sound of her departure the way it swallowed everything, completely, without echo. Caedric watched from the study window until the carriage disappeared beyond the tree line. Then he turned back to his desk, opened a dispatch from the Lord Chancellor, and resumed working as if the last 72 hours had been a minor administrative interruption. The brandy decanter was empty by noon. 300 miles south and east, beyond the rolling farmlands and industrial cities of the Midlands, the coastal province of Greyhaven clung to the edge of the country like something the land itself was trying to shake loose. Cliffs of black shale dropped 200 feet into churning Atlantic water. Fishing villages huddled in coves carved by millennia of tidal violence, their stone cottages low and wind-battered, their harbors choked with boats that looked like they had survived more wars than the men who sailed them. Seraphina arrived at dusk on the third day. The carriage had not been designed for roads this rough, and by the time it reached the coastal village of Dunmore, one axle was cracked, and the driver's face carried the expression of a man who had been personally betrayed by geography. She paid him. He left without speaking. She stood alone on the muddy track that passed for a main street, her trunk at her feet, the wind pulling her hair sideways with a violence that seemed almost personal. The village was 20 buildings arranged around a stone harbor, a tavern with no sign, a general store with clouded windows, a row of fishermen's cottages whose chimneys leaked smoke that the wind tore apart before it could rise 10 feet. No one came to greet her. No one knew she was coming. The Duchess of Blackthorne had not informed anyone of her arrival because the Duchess of Blackthorne no longer existed. The woman standing in the mud was simply Seraphina. And Seraphina had no title, no household, no staff, no reputation, and no plan beyond the next 48 hours. What she had was 12 pounds in a purse tucked inside her cloak. A letter of introduction to a local landlord that Renwick had slipped into her trunk without Caedric's knowledge, and a secret that pressed against her awareness with increasing urgency every morning when the nausea arrived before dawn like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. She found lodging at the tavern. A room above the kitchen, small enough that the bed touched 3 walls simultaneously, with a window that faced the harbor and a ceiling low enough to remind her every morning that the world had gotten smaller. The tavern keeper was a broad-shouldered widow named Margaret Hale, who asked no questions, charged fair rent, and communicated primarily through the strategic deployment of silence. Seraphina respected that immediately. She had become fluent in silence. It was the only language Blackthorne had taught her that proved useful beyond its walls. The first week was annihilation. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that arrives with screaming and broken glass and visible destruction. The quiet kind. The kind that strips a person's identity down to raw material and leaves them standing in front of a mirror wondering which version of themselves is real. Seraphina had been a duchess. Before that, a baron's daughter. Before that, a child raised in houses where the number of servants exceeded the number of rooms, where education meant learning which fork to use at formal dinners and which topics were considered appropriate for feminine conversation. She could arrange flowers for a state banquet. She could navigate the social hierarchies of aristocratic ballrooms with the precision of a military strategist. None of those skills mattered in Greyhaven. In Greyhaven, the tide schedule mattered. The price of salt cod mattered. Whether the fishing boats returned before the storm hit mattered. The aristocratic world she had inhabited for 26 years was as relevant to coastal survival as the ability to recite poetry was to a drowning man. She spent the first 3 days sitting in her room above the kitchen, listening to the wind howl against the harbor walls, feeling the nausea rise and fall with the regularity of the tides below, and confronting a truth that no amount of aristocratic training had prepared her for. She was completely alone, and she was carrying a child fathered by a man who had signed her out of his life with the same pen he used to authorize grain shipments. On the 4th morning, Margaret Hale knocked on her door at dawn. There is a boy in the harbor with a gash on his arm deep enough to see bone. His mother is hysterical. The nearest doctor is 40 miles inland and the roads flooded last night. Seraphina opened the door. Why are you telling me this? Margaret studied her with the direct, undecorated gaze of a woman who had buried a husband, raised 4 children alone, and survived 3 decades of coastal winters without complaint. Because you have soft hands and sharp eyes, and every woman who walks through my door carrying that particular kind of silence is either running from something or preparing to become someone else. Either way, you are awake, and that boy is bleeding. Seraphina dressed in 4 minutes. She followed Margaret down to the harbor in the gray pre-dawn light, her cloak pulled tight against the salt wind. her hair already tangled by the time they reached the stone steps leading to the waterfront. The boy was 9. His name was Thomas. He had fallen against an anchor chain while helping his father secure the boats, and the wound on his forearm was exactly as Margaret described. Deep, clean, exposing the pale architecture of muscle and tendon beneath dark skin. His mother was a fisherman's wife named Clara, who held her son's hand with a grip that suggested she was physically preventing him from bleeding to death through sheer willpower. "I need clean water," Seraphina said. She did not know where the words came from. She had no medical training. She had read anatomy texts in Blackthorne's library out of boredom during the long winter months when Caedric was away at Parliament. But reading about wound care and performing wound care were separated by the same distance that separates knowing the word fire from putting your hand in the flame. Boiled water, clean cloth, and whatever alcohol Margaret keeps behind that bar. "Rum," Margaret said. "That works." She cleaned the wound. She closed it using a technique she had read about in a journal authored by a military surgeon during the colonial campaigns, pressing the edges of torn skin together with steady hands, while Thomas screamed into his mother's shoulder and Clara whispered things that were not prayers because people in Greyhaven did not pray to anything except the tide and the weather, and both of those answered on their own schedule. The stitches were imperfect, uneven, the work of an amateur operating on instinct and borrowed knowledge. But by the time the sun cleared the eastern headland and threw long golden light across the harbor, Thomas was asleep in his mother's arms, the bleeding had stopped, and Seraphina was sitting on the stone steps with blood on her hands and rum on her sleeves and something cracking open inside her chest that felt dangerous and unfamiliar and absolutely, irreversibly alive. Margaret sat beside her, said nothing for a while, then offered a cigarette, which Seraphina declined, and a cup of black tea, which she accepted. "You are not what I expected," Margaret said eventually. "What did you expect?" "A ghost. Most women who arrive the way you did become ghosts within a month. They fade, drink, stop eating. Eventually the mail coach takes them somewhere else and no one remembers their name." "I cannot afford to be a ghost." "Why not?" Seraphina placed one hand against her abdomen. The gesture was unconscious. Protective. The oldest language the human body possessed, older than speech, older than thought, rooted in the biological machinery that existed before civilization decided to complicate survival with politics and property law. Margaret looked at Seraphina's hand, then at her face, then back at her hand. "How far along?" 2 months, perhaps closer to 3. "Does he know?" "No." "Will you tell him?" Seraphina stared at the harbor. The fishing boats rocked against their moorings. Seabirds circled overhead, crying into the wind with voices that sounded like accusations. "I will not give him another piece of property to manage." Margaret nodded slowly. Not in agreement, in recognition. The nod of a woman who understood that some decisions were not about logic or strategy, but about the fundamental refusal to be consumed twice by the same fire. They sat together on the harbor steps while the village woke around them. Fishermen hauled nets. Children chased dogs between the cottages. Smoke rose from chimneys and was immediately destroyed by the wind. The world continued with the stubborn indifference of a machine that did not care who watched it operate. And in that unremarkable moment, sitting on cold stone with blood drying on her wrists and tea warming her palms and a new life assembling itself cell by cell beneath her heart, Seraphina Vale began the slow, agonizing, magnificent process of discovering who she was when no one was watching. 400 miles north, in the mahogany silence of Blackthorne's study, Duke Caedric Vale signed the final parliamentary dispatch of the evening and reached for a brandy decanter that was already empty. He stared at the crystal. The firelight caught the facets and threw fractured light across the ceiling like something shattered trying to reassemble itself. Renwick appeared in the doorway. "Will there be anything else this evening, Your Grace?" "The Eastern Gallery," Caedric said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. Thinner, as if the room had gotten larger since morning. "The wall, where the portrait was." "Yes, Your Grace?" "Have it repainted." "Of course. What color would you prefer?" Caedric did not answer immediately. He was looking at the empty brandy decanter with an expression that Renwick had never seen on his employer's face in 23 years of service. It was not grief. Grief required acknowledgement of loss, and Caedric Vale had not yet admitted that anything had been lost. It was something worse. It was the first hairline fracture in a foundation that had held for 34 years. The almost imperceptible sound of internal architecture beginning to fail. "The same color," Caedric said finally. "Paint it the same color as the rest of the wall." "That will not fully conceal the outline, Your Grace. The original paint has faded around the frame. There will still be a visible difference." Caedric turned to look at his valet. The firelight carved his face into angles that looked like they could cut glass. "Then paint the entire wall." Renwick bowed and withdrew. Caedric sat alone in the study, surrounded by dispatches and empty crystal and the suffocating silence of a house that had suddenly become too large for one man, and told himself for the fourth time that day that he had made the correct decision. The storm returned at midnight. Lightning split the darkness above Blackthorne Keep, and somewhere in the howling chaos between thunder and rain, the grandfather clock struck 12, marking the end of the first day of a war that Caedric Vale did not yet know he had already lost. 300 miles away, Seraphina slept with her hand pressed against her stomach, and the sound of the ocean breaking against the cliffs below her window like something ancient and patient, waiting for the world to remember what it had forgotten. 6 weeks after Seraphina's departure, the eastern gallery wall was repainted twice. The first coat failed to conceal the rectangular outline where her portrait had hung for 3 years. The second coat matched the surrounding surface, but created a texture difference visible in afternoon light, a smoothness amid the aged plaster that announced its own newness like a lie told too carefully. Renwick suggested hanging a landscape painting over the spot. Caedric refused. He wanted the wall blank. He wanted the absence to be architectural rather than personal. What he got instead was a surface that reminded every person who walked that corridor that something had been removed and that the removal had required effort. Caedric did not walk the eastern gallery anymore. He rerouted his evening circuit through the western wing without acknowledging the change, and Renwick noted the adjustment in the household log the way he noted all adjustments. Silently, without interpretation. The dispatches from Parliament accumulated. Trade negotiations with continental shipping magnates required the Duke's personal attention. 3 noble families had petitioned for audience regarding territorial boundary disputes that had festered since autumn. The Lord Chancellor sent increasingly pointed letters about Caedric's absence from the spring legislative session, each one wrapped in the diplomatic language that powerful men used when they wanted to say, "Sit down and do your job," without actually saying it. Caedric handled all of it. He handled it the way he handled everything, with precision, with control, with the mechanical competence of a man who had replaced his internal architecture with administrative systems so sophisticated that emotion could not find a point of entry. But the brandy consumption had doubled. Renwick tracked this as well. Not because he was asked to, but because 23 years of service had taught him that the distance between a functioning duke and a collapsing one could be measured in fluid ounces. On a Tuesday morning in late March, Caedric summoned his intelligence secretary, a compact, sharp-eyed man named Aldrich Voss, who managed the Duke's network of informants across 6 provinces with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that information was the only currency that never devalued. "I need a status report on Greyhaven Province," Caedric said. He was standing behind his desk, which meant the conversation was meant to be short. Caedric sat for discussions. He stood for instructions. Voss remained near the door. "Greyhaven specifically, Your Grace? Or the southern coastal territories broadly?" "Greyhaven. Any particular area of interest? Economic output? Population health? Shipping routes?" Voss studied his employer's face with the careful neutrality of a man whose survival depended on knowing exactly which questions to ask and which to bury. "Of course, Your Grace. I will have a comprehensive briefing within the week." 3 days. 3 days, then. Voss turned to leave. Caedric's voice caught him at the threshold. "Voss. Your Grace? The report should include any notable persons recently arrived in the region, physicians, merchants, anyone whose presence represents a deviation from established population patterns." The silence that followed was loaded with everything neither man was willing to say aloud. Voss understood the request. He understood it the way a locksmith understands a broken lock. The mechanism was visible, the damage was obvious, and the owner was pretending the door still functioned normally. Understood, Your Grace. He withdrew. Caedric returned to his dispatches. The brandy decanter caught the morning light and threw a prismatic smear across the ceiling that looked, for one disorienting moment, like the amber of a color he associated with nothing in particular. He poured a glass, drank it before noon for the first time since his father's funeral. 300 miles south, Seraphina was elbow-deep in mud. The drainage channel behind St. Aurelia Hall had collapsed during the previous night's storm, flooding the lower storage rooms where she kept the dried herb inventory that had taken her 6 weeks to build. Foxglove, yarrow, elderflower, chamomile, willow bark, all of it cataloged in a leather journal she had purchased from the general store with money earned by treating a merchant's infected tooth, organized by medicinal application using classification systems she had reconstructed from the crumbling medical texts found in the hall's abandoned library. Gone. Waterlogged and rotting in 3 inches of brown water. She stood in the flooded room with her sleeves pushed past her elbows and her boots soaked through, staring at 6 weeks of work dissolving into mud, and felt the particular brand of fury that belongs exclusively to people who have rebuilt from nothing and been forced to watch the nothing return. Margaret appeared in the doorway holding a lantern. How bad? Everything below the second shelf. The feverfew? Destroyed. Margaret set the lantern on a dry ledge and waded into the room without hesitation. She began pulling salvageable bundles from the upper shelves, working with the practiced efficiency of a woman who understood that grief over lost resources was a luxury and that rebuilding was a schedule. They worked in silence for 20 minutes. The water was cold enough to numb their fingers. The smell of wet stone and decomposing plant matter filled the room, with an earthiness that was not unpleasant, just relentless, the smell of systems returning to their base components. You should not be doing this, Margaret said finally. I am aware. You are 4 months along. Lifting wet crates in freezing water is not advisable. Neither is losing the only fever treatment available to 300 people before summer sickness arrives. Seraphina. Margaret. They looked at each other across the flooded room. 2 women standing in muddy water holding bundles of half-ruined herbs, conducting the kind of negotiation that happens between people who respect each other too much for dishonesty and care about each other too much for silence. I will not stop, Seraphina said. I understand the risk. I have calculated it, and I have decided that the version of survival that requires me to sit in a dry room while the work drowns is not a version I am willing to accept. Well, that sounds like something a stubborn woman would say right before she collapses. It sounds like something a woman who has already collapsed once would say when she has decided it will not happen again. Margaret held her gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, shifted the bundle to her opposite arm, and resumed working. They saved 60% of the inventory. The rest was composted behind the hall, returned to the earth with the unceremonious practicality that Greyhaven applied to all losses. Things either survived or they fed something that did. Sentimentality required surplus, and surplus did not exist on this coast. By April, Seraphina's reputation had metastasized beyond Dunmore. The fishing villages along the Greyhaven coast communicated through a network of supply boats, tavern gossip, and the particular brand of oral tradition that thrives in communities where literacy rates are low and memory is long. Word of the woman at St. Aurelia Hall traveled this network with the persistence of tide, reaching harbors and market towns 20 and 30 miles distant. A healer, not a doctor, not a trained physician with university credentials and the social authority that came with them. A woman who washed wounds with boiled water when everyone else used creek water, who used willow bark tea to bring fevers down when the traditional approach was to pile blankets on and wait, who treated infected cuts with honey and clean cloth when the alternative was amputation by a barber with a saw and a bottle of gin. People came, first individually, then in small groups, fishermen with hands mangled by rigging, women with childbirth complications that had been festering for weeks, children with coughs that would not break, old men with joint pain so severe they had not slept properly in months. Seraphina treated them all. Not because she was qualified. She reminded herself of this constantly. The gap between what she knew and what a trained physician knew was a canyon she could see but not cross. She treated them because the canyon between what she could do and what was otherwise available was even wider. And in that mathematics of inadequacy, her imperfect knowledge was still the best option these people had. She delivered her first baby on a Wednesday afternoon in a cottage that smelled of fish oil and wood smoke. The mother was 15. The labor was complicated. The baby was breech. Seraphina had read about breech deliveries in a surgical manual published 40 years earlier by a military doctor who had learned obstetrics in field hospitals, and the distance between reading about a procedure and performing it with her own hands while a teenage girl screamed and the baby's heartbeat grew fainter was a distance that remade her entirely. The baby survived. The mother survived. Seraphina walked back to St. Aurelia Hall at midnight, sat on the stone steps overlooking the harbor, and shook for 45 minutes. Not from cold, from the adrenaline aftermath of holding two lives in hands that had been trained to arrange dinner place settings. Her own body was changing. The pregnancy announced itself with increasing authority. The nausea had subsided by the 4th month, but was replaced by a fatigue that arrived each afternoon like a wall she had to climb. Her center of gravity shifted. Her appetite became unpredictable. Ravenous at breakfast, absent at dinner, demanding specific foods at 2 in the morning with the irrational insistence of a body running its own agenda. She adapted. Adaptation was no longer a choice. It was metabolic. The woman who had sat in Blackthorne's drawing room in pale gray, waiting beside cathedral windows for something she could not name, had been replaced by a woman who woke before dawn, mixed medicines until noon, treated patients until dusk, and collapsed into a bed that touched 3 walls with a bone-deep exhaustion that was somehow more restful than any night she had spent in the silk-sheeted chambers of the keep. She did not think about Caedric. That was the lie she told herself, and she told it with such consistency that it almost became functional. She did not think about him when she woke in the dark and reached across the narrow bed for a body that was not there. She did not think about him when she treated a fisherman whose hands reminded her of the way Caedric's hands looked when he gripped the edge of his desk during difficult conversations, tendons visible beneath the skin, knuckles whitening with restrained force. She did not think about him when she felt the baby move for the first time, a flutter so faint it could have been imagination, and realized that the child's father did not know it existed. She thought about survival instead. Survival was simpler. Survival had rules that did not change based on someone else's emotional availability. Feed the body. Protect the work. Build something that cannot be taken away by a man with a pen and a leather folder. The intelligence report arrived at Blackthorne Keep on a Friday afternoon, bound in plain brown paper, delivered by a courier who did not know its contents. Voss had been thorough. The report covered Greyhaven's economic output, shipping schedules, population census data, and a detailed appendix on recent arrivals to the coastal villages. The appendix was 4 pages long. 3.5 of those pages covered merchants, seasonal laborers, and a retired naval officer who had purchased property near the southern headland. The final half-page concerned a woman residing at St. Aurelia Hall in the village of Dunmore. No surname provided by local sources. Known locally as the Healer. Described as approximately mid-20s, auburn hair, educated speech patterns inconsistent with the local population, had established an informal medical practice treating coastal residents, was reportedly pregnant. Caedric read the final half-page 3 times. Then he set the report on his desk, walked to the window, and stared at the northern moors for 11 minutes without moving. Renwick found him there when he came to announce dinner. "Your Grace, the kitchen has prepared—" "Cancel it." "Your Grace?" "Cancel dinner. Cancel the morning's appointments. All of them." Renwick did not ask why. He had served long enough to recognize the particular quality of stillness that preceded seismic decisions in the Vale household. It was not calm. It was the absence of movement that happens when every internal system redirects toward a single calculation. "Shall I have the stables prepare?" "No." Caedric turned from the window. His face carried an expression Renwick had never catalogued in 23 years, something between fury and vertigo. The face of a man who has just discovered that the ground beneath his feet is not as solid as the architecture suggested. "I will ride alone." "To where, Your Grace?" Caedric did not answer. He was already moving toward the door, his stride carrying the particular velocity of a man who has spent 6 weeks pretending that a decision does not need to be made and has just run out of pretense. "Your Grace," Renwick said, his voice carrying a note of careful urgency that he deployed perhaps twice per decade. "If I may, the roads south are not suitable for solo travel. The spring floods have—" "Renwick, Your Grace." "The woman in Greyhaven, the healer." Caedric's voice was a blade held sideways, all edge, no width. "She is carrying my child, and I learned this from an intelligence report instead of from her mouth. Do you understand what that means?" Renwick understood precisely what it meant. It meant that Seraphina had chosen to keep the pregnancy secret. It meant she had calculated the risk of telling him against the risk of silence, and concluded that silence was safer. It meant that the woman Caedric had discarded as a failed contractual obligation had decided that the Duke of Blackthorne could not be trusted with the knowledge of his own heir. And it meant that Caedric, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, was confronting the possibility that a decision he had made was not merely suboptimal, but catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. "I understand, Your Grace." "Then you understand why I'm not waiting for suitable road conditions." He rode out within the hour. No escort, no carriage, no coat of arms. A single horse, fast and dark, carrying a man whose control had finally cracked along fault lines he had spent 34 years pretending did not exist. The journey south took 3 days through roads that were exactly as treacherous as Renwick had warned. Spring floods had transformed sections of the main highway into rivers of brown water that swallowed hoofprints before they could form. Caedric rode through them without slowing. He slept 4 hours total across 3 nights, in roadside inns whose beds smelled of mildew and whose proprietors looked at him with the particular wariness reserved for men who travel alone, fast, and without luggage. He ate poorly. He drank nothing. The enforced sobriety after 6 weeks of accelerating consumption produced a headache that settled behind his eyes like a second skull, tighter than the first. He ignored it the way he ignored all signals from his own body. The body was a vehicle. It required maintenance, not attention. On the 3rd evening, he crested the coastal ridge above Dunmore and saw Greyhaven for the first time. The village was smaller than he had imagined, uglier. The cottages huddled against the cliff face like animals seeking shelter from a predator they could not see, their stone walls stained dark by decades of salt spray, their rooflines sagging with the particular exhaustion of structures that have survived not through strength, but through stubbornness. The harbor was a crescent of black rock enclosing a dozen fishing boats. Nets hung from wooden frames like giant spiderwebs drying in the wind. Smoke rose from chimneys and was immediately shredded by the coastal gusts. The entire scene possessed the raw, unbeautiful functionality of a place that existed solely because the people in it refused to leave. And there, on the headland above the village, stood St. Aurelia Hall. A former monastery, its stone walls half consumed by ivy, its windows glowing with candlelight that flickered against the darkening sky. A building that looked like it had been abandoned by everyone except one person who had decided it was enough. Caedric stared at the hall for a long time. The horse stamped and shifted beneath him, sensing the tension in its rider's body. The wind pulled at his coat. The last light of day retreated behind the western headland, leaving the sky the color of a bruise. He had come to claim what was his. That was the story he told himself during 3 days of hard riding. The heir, the bloodline, the continuation of the Vale dynasty. He had come because the contractual failure he had identified 6 weeks ago had been rendered void by new biological information, and the situation required administrative correction. But standing on that ridge, looking down at a village that his money could purchase outright, and a building that his title could commandeer with a single letter, he felt something that his internal architecture had no classification for, a sensation that lived somewhere between his sternum and his spine, heavy as stone, shapeless as water. The feeling of a man staring at the consequences of his own choices arranged in physical space and realizing that the distance between power and wisdom was not a gap, but a canyon, and he had been standing on the wrong side his entire life. He descended toward the village. The horse picked its way down the coastal track with the careful precision of an animal navigating terrain it did not trust. Dunmore swallowed the sound of his arrival the way it swallowed everything. Completely. Without ceremony. He found her at dusk. Not in the hall. In the harbor. Standing on the stone quay beside a fishing boat, helping an old man lift a crate of medical supplies onto the deck. Her sleeves were rolled past her forearms. Her hair was loose, tangled by the wind into dark ropes that whipped across her face. She wore a heavy wool dress the color of storm clouds, practical and shapeless, and her boots were caked with mud up to the ankles. She was visibly pregnant. Not dramatically, not in the way that aristocratic painters depicted expectant mothers, serene and glowing and draped in silk. She was pregnant the way working women are pregnant. Her body had changed with the blunt efficiency of biology pursuing its own agenda regardless of aesthetics. Her face was thinner. Her movements carried the careful deliberation of a woman whose center of gravity had shifted and who had learned to compensate through awareness rather than restriction. She looked nothing like the Duchess of Blackthorne. She looked like a woman who had survived the destruction of the Duchess of Blackthorne and built something else entirely from the wreckage. And she looked, standing on that wind-blasted quay in the last light of day, more completely herself than Caedric had ever seen her. She saw him before he spoke. Her hands stopped moving on the crate. Her spine straightened by half an inch. Her chin lifted in a motion so small it was almost invisible. The instinctive posture of an animal that has detected a predator and is deciding whether to fight or disappear. She did not run. She did not smile. She did not perform any version of welcome or submission or surprise. She looked at him the way the cliffs looked at the ocean, with the steady, ancient patience of something that has been hit so many times it no longer flinches. "You should not be here," she said. Caedric dismounted. His boots hit the cobblestones with a sound that echoed off the harbor walls. "You are carrying my child." I am carrying my child." "Seraphina, no." The word came out sharp enough to cut. The old fisherman beside her quietly stepped back, reading the atmospheric pressure between these two people with the instinctive accuracy of a man who spent his life reading weather. "You do not get to say my name like that. Not here. Not after what you signed. The dissolution can be reversed. I have the authority to—" "Authority." She almost laughed. The sound that came out was closer to something breaking. "You rode 300 miles to talk to me about authority. You found out about this child through a spy report instead of from me. And your first instinct is to stand on a dock and tell me what you have the authority to do." The wind howled between them. Waves crashed against the harbor wall, sending cold spray across the cobblestones. The fishing boats creaked against their moorings. And in the diminishing light, two people who had once shared a bed and a name and a house full of silence stood 5 feet apart and stared at each other across a distance that had nothing to do with geography. "Why did you not tell me?" Caedric asked. His voice had changed. The administrative tone was gone, stripped away by 3 days of hard riding and bad sleep and the relentless erosion of a headache he refused to acknowledge. What remained was rawer, closer to the surface, the voice of a man asking a question he was not certain he wanted answered. Seraphina set the crate down on the quay, straightened, placed one hand against the small of her back in the instinctive gesture of a pregnant woman redistributing weight. "Because I knew exactly what you would do," she said. "You would ride here. You would invoke your authority. You would attempt to recover the heir the way you recover misplaced assets, through logistics and legal mechanisms and the overwhelming application of power. And at no point in that entire process would it occur to you to ask whether I wanted to be recovered." The harbor fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath between gusts. Caedric stared at her, and for the first time since the night he signed the dissolution papers, something behind his eyes shifted. Not softened, shifted, the way tectonic plates shift before an earthquake, invisible from the surface, catastrophic in implication. "I am not leaving Greyhaven," he said. Seraphina's expression did not change, but her hand moved from her back to her abdomen. The protective gesture, the ancient one, the one that predated language and civilization and every legal document ever drafted by men who believed they could legislate biology into compliance. "Then you should find somewhere to sleep," she said, "because it will not be in my bed." She turned back to the crate, resumed loading the fishing boat, and did not look at him again. Caedric stood on the darkening quay, salt wind cutting through his riding coat, and felt the entire framework of his existence tremble on its foundations, like a building that has just discovered it was constructed on sand. He did not leave. He did not speak. He stood there until the last light died and the harbor dissolved into darkness, and the only sound was the ocean hammering the cliffs below with the patient, relentless violence of something that had been reshaping stone since before men learned to build walls against it. Caedric slept in the tavern, or rather, he occupied a room in the tavern and stared at the ceiling for 6 hours while the wind screamed against the harbor walls and the smell of fish oil and coal smoke seeped through the floorboards beneath him. Margaret Hale had given him the room without asking his name, charged him the same rate she charged everyone, and communicated through the transaction a complete indifference to his title, his wealth, and his visible distress that was more disorienting than hostility would have been. He was not accustomed to irrelevance. The Duke of Blackthorne entered rooms and the architecture of social interaction rearranged itself around him. People adjusted their posture, modulated their voices, performed the 1,000 micro-submissions that power demands from proximity. In Dunmore, the fishermen glanced at him and returned to their nets. The children ignored him entirely. Margaret poured his ale with the same mechanical efficiency she applied to every other customer and did not refill his glass until he asked. He was furniture, expensive furniture, poorly suited to the room, but furniture nonetheless. By the third morning, he had established a pattern that he did not recognize as a siege campaign, but which functioned exactly like one. He rose before dawn, walked to the harbor, positioned himself within visual range of St. Aurelia Hall, and waited for Seraphina to emerge. She emerged at 6 every morning, crossed the courtyard carrying a leather satchel of medical supplies, descended the coastal path to the village, entered whichever cottage required her attention that day, and operated for 12 to 14 hours without acknowledging his existence. He watched. She worked. The ocean filled the silence between them with the relentless percussion of waves against the cliff face, and neither of them spoke about the conversation on the quay because neither of them had finished processing the damage it had caused. On the fourth day, Caedric followed her to a cottage on the eastern edge of the village, where a fisherman's wife was dying of an infection that had started in a minor cut on her shin and migrated upward through the tissue with the slow, methodical cruelty of biology asserting dominance over hope. The woman was 43. Her name was Edith. She had 4 children and a husband who sat outside the cottage door whittling a piece of driftwood into nothing because his hands needed something to do while his mind processed information it could not accept. Seraphina was inside for 3 hours. When she came out, her sleeves were stained and her face carried the particular expression of someone who had just fought a battle they knew they were going to lose but fought anyway because the alternative was complicity with the outcome. "She needs a surgeon," Seraphina said. Not to Caedric, to the husband, to the empty air, to the fundamental inadequacy of her own training. "The infection has reached the bone. I can manage the pain, I can slow the progression, but I cannot cut." The husband looked up from his driftwood. His eyes were red and dry, past the point where tears served any functional purpose. "Then she dies." "Not today, not this week, but eventually yes, unless someone with surgical training intervenes." "The nearest surgeon is in Ashford, 40 miles. "I know." "She cannot travel 40 miles. The road would kill her before the infection." "I know that too." The silence that followed was the kind that exists in rooms where every available option has been examined and discarded, and the only thing remaining is the weather and the waiting. Caedric stood 6 feet away, close enough to hear every word, far enough to remain technically uninvolved, and felt something shift in his understanding of the woman he had married with the same emotional investment he applied to purchasing horses. She was losing. She knew she was losing, and she stayed in the fight anyway, not because she believed in miracles or dramatic reversals, but because the act of fighting was itself the point. The refusal to abandon the field. The insistence on presence when presence was the only thing left to offer. It was a form of courage that Caedric's world did not recognize. Aristocratic courage was performative, visible, rewarded with titles and land grants and paintings in government halls. This was the other kind. The quiet, grinding, unrewarded kind that happened in cottages that smelled of infection and salt, and the slow metabolic process of a body consuming itself. He stepped forward before he had finished deciding to step forward. "I can have a surgeon here in 2 days," he said. Both Seraphina and the husband turned to look at him. The husband with confusion, Seraphina with something colder and more complex. Recognition layered over resistance, layered over the involuntary calculation of a woman weighing a man's usefulness against his history of destruction. "How?" the husband asked. "I have resources. A rider dispatched today can reach Ashford by tomorrow evening. A surgeon with proper instruments can be here the following morning." "You would do this? For a woman you have never met, in a village you do not belong to." "I would do this because it needs doing." It was the first honest sentence Caedric had spoken in Greyhaven. He knew it was honest because it cost him something to say it. The truth has weight. Lies are aerodynamic, designed to travel fast and far without resistance. Truth is heavy, blunt, shaped wrong for the mechanisms of a man who has spent his life engineering the distance between what he feels and what he permits others to see. Seraphina said nothing. She watched him the way a woman watches a man she once trusted pick up a tool she needs, knowing that the tool is necessary and the man is dangerous, and the distance between those two facts is the space where survival decisions are made without the luxury of certainty. "Send the rider," she said. Caedric sent the rider within the hour. The efficiency was reflex. He identified the fastest horse in the village, negotiated its temporary use from the owner with a sum that exceeded the animal's market value by a factor of 3. Wrote instructions for the surgeon with the specificity of a military dispatch, and handed the sealed letter to a young fisherman named Byron, who had a reputation for speed and the good sense to ask no questions about why a stranger was paying him a year's wages to ride 40 miles overnight. The surgeon arrived 31 hours later. Edith survived the operation. The infection was excised from the bone with the methodical precision of a man who had performed the procedure enough times to do it without thinking and never enough times to do it without caring. She would walk again. She would lose partial feeling in the affected leg. She would live. Caedric paid the surgeon, paid for the medications, paid for the additional supplies Seraphina identified as necessary for the recovery period. He did all of this without negotiation, without acknowledgement, without the performance of generosity that aristocratic charity typically demanded. Seraphina noticed. She noticed the way the payment was handled, directly, quietly, without the construction of debt that powerful men typically embedded in their assistants like hooks inside bait. And something in her assessment of his presence shifted by a fraction of a degree, not toward trust. Trust was a structure, and structures required foundations, and foundations required time. What shifted was closer to the acknowledgement that the man standing in Greyhaven was not entirely the same man who had handed her a leather folder in the drawing room of Blackthorne Keep. Whether the difference was real or strategic, she could not yet determine, and she was too experienced in the architecture of Caedric Vale's behavior to mistake a tactical adjustment for genuine transformation. But she stopped refusing to be in the same room with him. That was week 1. By week 2, Caedric had become a logistical fixture. He secured lumber for repairing St. Aurelia Hall's collapsed drainage system, arranged supply deliveries from inland merchants who would never have dealt with a coastal village but who responded to the Blackthorne name with the immediate compliance of men who understood that some customers were not optional. He repaired a section of the harbor wall himself, working alongside fishermen who handed him tools without conversation and evaluated his usefulness with the unsentimental pragmatism of people who judged others by what they built rather than what they owned. His hands blistered, then calloused. The distinction mattered more than he understood. On the 15th night, Seraphina found him sitting on the harbor steps after midnight, his riding coat discarded, his shirt sleeves pushed past his elbows, staring at the black water with the unfocused gaze of a man conducting an internal audit whose results he was not prepared to accept. She sat beside him. Not close. 3 feet of stone between them. Enough distance for safety. Not enough for denial. "Edith is recovering," she said. "Good." Her husband brought fish to the hall today. 6 mackerel. He said they were for the man who sent the rider. Caedric said nothing. The waves lapped against the harbor wall with the rhythmic indifference of a system that operated independently of human opinion. "Why are you still here, Caedric?" "You know why. I know the reason you gave yourself, the heir, the bloodline, the contractual correction. I am asking why you are actually still here, because the man who rode to Greyhaven for an heir would have sent lawyers by now. He would have filed injunctions. He would have used power instead of lumber and fish payments and 14-hour days hauling stone for a drainage channel that has nothing to do with his dynasty." The silence that followed was the most dangerous kind. The kind where the truth is visible but not yet spoken, suspended between two people like a blade balanced on its edge, waiting for the slightest vibration to determine which direction it falls. "I do not know," Caedric said. 3 words. The most honest sentence he had spoken in 34 years. More honest than the one in the fisherman's cottage. More honest than anything he had said in Parliament or in boardrooms or in the mahogany study of Blackthorne Keep, where honesty was a liability and control was the only currency that maintained its value. Seraphina did not respond. She sat on the cold stone, one hand resting on her swollen abdomen, the other braced against the step behind her, and let the silence hold the weight of his admission without trying to shape it into something more manageable. They sat together on the harbor steps while the tide came in and the stars burned overhead with the cold, ancient indifference of objects that had been watching human beings fail at intimacy since before the species learned to build shelters. Then she went inside, and he stayed on the steps until the sky began to lighten, and neither of them knew that 260 miles north, in a study that smelled of old leather and cold ambition, a man named Lord Ashworth was reading an intelligence report that would destroy everything both of them were building. Lord Marcus Ashworth had served as the Vale family's political steward for 19 years. He managed the duchy's parliamentary alliances, brokered territorial agreements, and maintained the delicate network of favors and threats that kept the Blackthorne political machine operational. He was 57, silver-haired, lean in the way that old money produces, a body maintained not through effort, but through the accumulated advantage of 3 generations of adequate nutrition and low physical labor. His eyes were the pale blue of glacial water and carried the same temperature. He had been loyal to Caedric's father. He had been loyal to Caedric. Loyalty, in Ashworth's operational vocabulary, meant the maintenance of an arrangement that served mutual interests. It did not mean affection. It did not mean permanence. It meant that the cost of betrayal had not yet exceeded the benefit of continued alliance. That calculation changed the moment Caedric rode south without explanation. Ashworth learned of the Duke's departure within 12 hours. His own intelligence network, older and more entrenched than Voss's, tracked Caedric's route to Greyhaven and identified the destination before the Duke had crossed the Midlands. Within 48 hours, Ashworth knew about Seraphina. Within 72, he knew about the pregnancy. Within a week, he had assembled the complete picture and understood, with the crystalline clarity of a man who had spent 40 years reading political architecture, exactly what was about to happen. Caedric was going to restore the marriage, restore the Duchess, produce the heir through the woman he had publicly discarded, and in doing so, he would destabilize the alliance structure that Ashworth had spent 2 decades constructing. Because the dissolution of the Vale marriage had not been merely personal, it had been political. 3 noble families had repositioned their entire dynastic strategies based on the assumption that Caedric would remarry. Daughters had been prepared. Dowries negotiated. Territorial concessions offered in exchange for the privilege of placing their bloodline adjacent to the most powerful dukedom in the north. If Seraphina returned, those agreements collapsed. Those families would not simply lose a strategic opportunity. They would lose face. And in the aristocratic world, losing face was more dangerous than losing money because money could be recovered and reputation could not. Ashworth did not make the decision to betray Caedric. He made the decision to protect the system that Caedric was threatening to destroy. The distinction mattered to Ashworth the way structural engineering mattered to architects. The building was more important than any individual room, and if one room needed to be demolished to preserve the integrity of the whole, that was not betrayal. That was maintenance. He sent 3 letters on the same evening, the first to Lord Harrington, whose daughter Eleanor had been the leading candidate for the Duke's second marriage. The second to the Marquess of Ashfield, who controlled the eastern trade routes that the Blackthorne estate depended upon for 40% of its revenue. The third to a man whose name appeared in no official record and whose services were retained through intermediaries whose intermediaries did not know the final client's identity. The first two letters proposed a coalition. The third proposed a solution. The coalition formed within a week. Harrington contributed political leverage. Ashfield contributed economic pressure. And the nameless man contributed expertise in the application of permanent solutions to temporary problems. The target was not Caedric. Killing a duke created more problems than it solved. Investigations, parliamentary inquiries, the kind of institutional scrutiny that destroyed everyone it touched regardless of guilt. The target was Seraphina, and the child. Because without the heir, the marriage restoration served no dynastic purpose. Without the heir, Caedric's emotional attachment became a political embarrassment rather than a political threat. Without the heir, the system could absorb the disruption and continue functioning according to the architecture Ashworth had spent 19 years perfecting. The order was simple, clean, designed to look like the kind of tragedy that the coastal provinces produced with sufficient regularity that no one would question the narrative. A storm, a collapsed building, a medical complication. The specifics were left to the professional, who charged a fee that was substantial by most standards, and trivial by the standards of men who measured wealth in territories rather than currency. Voss intercepted the first letter, not through intelligence, through accident. A courier carrying dispatches between Harrington's estate and Ashford mistook an inn on the northern road for one 12 miles further south, and delivered the sealed correspondence to a stable hand who happened to be one of Voss's peripheral informants. The informant did not open the letter. He noted the seal, noted the route, noted the destination, and included the observation in his weekly report to Voss with the casual indifference of a man who did not understand what he was looking at. Voss understood immediately. He rode for Greyhaven without authorization, without informing the household, and without stopping for anything except horse changes at coaching inns along the route. He arrived 46 hours after the letter was intercepted, hollow-eyed and road-filthy, and found Caedric hauling timber behind St. Aurelia Hall with the focused intensity of a man who had discovered that physical labor was the only reliable mechanism for processing emotions his vocabulary could not accommodate. "Your Grace," Caedric straightened. Voss's appearance in Greyhaven was not merely unexpected, it was categorically impossible under normal operational parameters. Voss did not leave Blackthorne unless the situation required his physical presence, which meant the situation had exceeded the capacity of written communication to convey its severity. "Inside," Caedric said. They moved into the hall's ground-floor room that Seraphina used as a treatment space. It smelled of dried herbs and candle wax, and the faint metallic undertone of blood that never fully leaves a room where wounds are regularly tended. Caedric closed the door. "Talk." Voss laid out the intelligence with the clinical precision of a man delivering a surgical diagnosis. The intercepted letter, the Harrington connection, the Ashfield involvement, the unnamed third party whose engagement implied operational intent rather than political posturing. Caedric listened without moving, without blinking, without any visible response that would indicate to an outside observer that the words entering his ears were fundamentally restructuring his understanding of his own world. Ashworth, 19 years. The man had managed the Vale political machine since Caedric was 15 years old, had attended his father's funeral, had stood beside Caedric during his first parliamentary address, and coached him through the procedural complexities with the patient thoroughness of a mentor who believed in the student's potential, had dined at Blackthorne's table, had been trusted with information that could destroy the dukedom if deployed against it, and now he had deployed it, not impulsively, not in anger, with the systematic architectural efficiency of a man dismantling a structure he had helped build because the structure no longer served his specifications. "How long?" Caedric asked. His voice was stripped of everything except the mechanical function of producing sound. Flat. Airless. The voice of a man whose internal systems have rerouted all resources away from emotion and toward calculation because emotion at this moment would be fatal. The third party was engaged 5 days ago. Based on standard operational timelines, the window is 7 to 14 days. Before what? Voss met his eyes. "Before they reach Greyhaven, Your Grace." The room contracted. The walls pressed inward. The candle flames bent sideways, as if the air pressure had changed, and in the silence between Voss's last word and Caedric's next breath, the Duke of Blackthorne experienced something he had no historical reference for. Terror. Not the performative kind, not the managed anxiety of a man navigating political complexity with the intellectual confidence that every problem has a solution if you identify the correct variables. This was the kind that begins in the spine and radiates outward through the nervous system like voltage, the kind that erases sophistication and education and 34 years of carefully constructed emotional insulation and reduces a man to the most fundamental version of himself. Someone was coming to kill the woman he had discarded, and the child he had only just learned existed. And the threat had been created not by his enemies, but by his most trusted ally, using the exact political machinery that Caedric himself had authorized and funded and celebrated as evidence of his own strategic genius. He had built the weapon. Ashworth had simply aimed it. "Where is Seraphina?" he asked. "In the village, eastern cottages. She left an hour ago." Caedric moved toward the door. "Your Grace." Voss's voice carried an edge that stopped him mid-stride. "There is more. Ashworth controls the ducal seal. He has authority to issue orders in your name while you are absent from Blackthorne. If he has not already repositioned your household guard, he will within days. Going back means walking into a structure that no longer belongs to you." The implications landed like sequential detonations. Ashworth did not just control the political alliances. He controlled the administrative apparatus. The household staff answered to his directives in the Duke's absence. The estate finances moved through accounts he co-managed. The intelligence network that had taken 20 years to build reported to a chain of command that Ashworth had embedded himself into at every critical junction. Caedric had not been betrayed by a man. He had been betrayed by a system, his own system. The beautiful, efficient, ruthless machine he had inherited from his father and refined into the most powerful political instrument in the Northern Territories had been turned against him with the same precision he had used to turn it against others. And standing in a treatment room that smelled of herbs and blood and the accumulated evidence of a woman who had built something real from nothing, Caedric Vale finally understood the cost of constructing a life in which trust was a liability rather than a foundation. Every alliance based on mutual advantage could be dissolved the moment advantage shifted. Every loyalty purchased with power expired the moment power wavered. Every system designed for control contained, by definition, the mechanisms for its own hijacking. He had spent 34 years building walls, and the walls had not protected him. They had simply ensured that when the siege came, it came from inside. He turned to Voss. "How many men can you trust? Not men loyal to Blackthorne. Men loyal to you personally." Voss calculated. 6, possibly 8. "Get them here, all of them, within 72 hours. "And the duchy?" "The duchy is a building on fire. I am not going back inside to save the furniture." He pushed through the door and walked into the fading coastal light. Seraphina was coming up the path from the village, her satchel over one shoulder, her hand pressed against her lower back, her hair wild with wind. She saw his face and stopped walking. What happened? Caedric closed the distance between them, not with the controlled stride of a duke approaching a subject. With the uneven, desperate velocity of a man who has just discovered that the distance between another person and himself is the only distance that matters, and he has been measuring the wrong things his entire life. "There are people coming to Greyhaven," he said, "people I trusted, people I built. And they are coming for you and for our child because I made the mistake of believing that power was a substitute for judgment." Seraphina's hand moved from her back to her stomach. The ancient gesture, the one that no empire could legislate and no duke could command. The gesture that said, in the nonverbal language of the body, that whatever came next would have to come through her first. "Tell me everything," she said. And for the first time in his life, Caedric Vale told someone the truth. Not the controlled strategic version of truth that he dispensed like currency in political negotiations. Not the administrative truth of reports and dispatches and legal documents. The actual truth. The ugly, complete, structurally devastating truth about who he was, what he had built, and exactly how efficiently the machine he had created was now being used to destroy the only things he had discovered were worth protecting. The wind picked up. Storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, stacking themselves against the darkening sky with the methodical patience of something that had been building force for a very long time. And inside St. Aurelia Hall, standing in a room that smelled of medicine and survival, a man who had once ruled through fear began the most terrifying transformation available to the human species. He asked for help, not from a subordinate, not from a system, from the woman he had wronged, in the place she had built without him, on terms that she would set and he would follow, because the alternative was losing everything, and the everything had changed definition so completely in the last 15 days that the man who had ridden into Greyhaven would not recognize the man standing here now. Seraphina studied his face, read the fracture lines, assessed the damage with the same clinical precision she applied to every wound that came through her door. Then she set down her satchel, pulled a chair from the wall, and sat. "Start from the beginning," she said, "and do not leave anything out." Seraphina listened for 47 minutes without interrupting. She sat in the wooden chair with her hands folded over her stomach, and her eyes fixed on Caedric's face with the clinical attention of a woman who had spent months learning to diagnose damage by reading surfaces. She listened to him describe Ashworth's 19-year tenure, the political alliances built on the assumption of the Vale marriage's permanence, the three noble families who had repositioned their dynastic strategies around a second wife who would never materialize, the unnamed professional whose engagement represented not a threat but a timeline. When he finished, the room held the particular silence that follows confession, not the comfortable silence of mutual understanding, the surgical silence of a wound that has been opened and is waiting to be assessed before anyone decides whether to stitch or cauterize. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Voss estimates 7 to 10 days from the engagement date. 5 days have already passed. So 2 to 5 days. Yes. And your household guard answers to Ashworth in your absence. Functionally, yes. And the men Voss is bringing, 6 to 8 men against a professional assassin backed by 3 noble houses. That is the mathematics." Seraphina stood. The chair scraped against the stone floor with a sound like a blade being drawn. She crossed to the window and looked out at the harbor where the fishing boats rocked against their moorings in the gathering wind. Her reflection in the glass was translucent, a ghost version of herself superimposed on the darkening sea. "You built this," she said. Not with accusation, with the flat precision of a field surgeon identifying the source of bleeding before deciding where to cut. Every mechanism being used against us right now exists because you created it or funded it or authorized someone else to create it on your behalf. Yes. And you came here without a plan, without resources, without anything except the assumption that your presence would be sufficient to resolve a situation that your presence created. Yes. She turned from the window. The candlelight caught the angles of her face and threw shadows beneath her cheekbones that made her look older, harder. Like a woman whose softness had been burned away by months of coastal wind and medical emergencies and the slow, relentless process of becoming someone who could not afford to be fragile. "Then we do not fight the machine," she said. "We break the machine." Caedric stared at her. "Explain." "Ashworth's coalition depends on secrecy. The moment his involvement becomes public knowledge, the alliance collapses. Harrington cannot afford to be associated with an assassination plot against a duke's wife. Ashfield's trade agreements with the Crown would be voided immediately, and Ashworth himself operates entirely on the perception of loyalty. Exposure does not just end his career, it ends his existence. You are proposing disclosure. I'm proposing weaponized disclosure, timed, targeted, delivered to the specific people and institutions that would cause maximum structural damage to everyone involved." Caedric looked at the woman standing in the candlelight of a converted monastery, 5 months pregnant, wearing a wool dress stained with someone else's blood, proposing a political counterstrike with the strategic clarity of a military commander reading a battlefield. "You learned this from me," he said. "I learned this from watching you. There is a difference. You use these tools to maintain control. I am suggesting we use them to survive. The objective changes the morality." "Does it?" "Ask me that question again when our child is safe." The planning took 6 hours. They worked through the night at the treatment room's wooden table, using materials that would have made Blackthorne's war room look theatrical. No maps drawn by royal cartographers. No intelligence dossiers bound in leather. A piece of charcoal, the back of a medical inventory ledger, and two minds that operated when aligned with a combined precision that neither had possessed alone. Seraphina understood the human architecture, which servants at Blackthorne were loyal to Caedric personally rather than to the administrative chain of command, which parliamentary members owed the Duke favors that exceeded their obligations to Ashworth, which noble families had been excluded from the conspiracy and would view its exposure as an opportunity to advance their own positions. Caedric understood the mechanical architecture, the communication channels, the courier routes, the documentary evidence that Ashworth would have generated through the sheer bureaucratic necessity of coordinating a three-house conspiracy. Financial transfers left traces. Letters required seals. Intermediaries had names, and names had addresses, and addresses could be visited by men who asked questions with enough authority to make silence more dangerous than speech. By dawn, they had constructed a counter-operation that was elegant in its brutality. Not a defense, a controlled demolition, designed to bring Ashworth's coalition down from the inside using the same structural principles that Ashworth had used to build it. Voss arrived the following evening with 7 men, not soldiers, not mercenaries. Intelligence operatives who had served the Duke's network long enough to understand that institutional loyalty was conditional but personal loyalty, the kind forged through years of shared risk and mutual dependence, was the only kind that held when the institution turned hostile. Caedric briefed them in the main hall of St. Aurelia. The building's acoustics carried his voice with a clarity that the stone walls seemed designed for, as if the monastery had always been waiting for someone to use it as a command center for a war that its original occupants would not have recognized, but whose fundamental dynamics they would have understood perfectly. Survival against organized power. Resistance conducted from the margins. The mathematics of fewer resources deployed with greater precision against a larger force that had mistaken size for invincibility. Ashworth believes I am isolated, Caedric said, emotionally compromised, operating without institutional support. He is correct on all 3 counts. What he has not calculated is that isolation strips a man down to essentials, and essentials are lighter than infrastructure. We move faster because we carry less. He assigned roles with the rapid, unadorned efficiency of a man who had spent his entire adult life giving orders, but who was now, for the first time, giving orders in service of something other than his own position. 2 men dispatched to intercept the documentary trail between Harrington and Ashfield. 1 man sent to Blackthorne to identify which household staff remained loyal and which had been turned. 2 men positioned along the coastal approaches to Greyhaven as an early warning system. Voss himself tasked with the most critical operation. Reaching the Lord Chancellor before Ashworth could preemptively discredit the Duke. And the professional? Voss asked. The man Ashworth hired. He is a contractor. Contractors respond to economics. If the contract becomes more expensive to fulfill than to abandon, he will abandon it. And if he does not? Caedric's jaw set. The candlelight turned his eyes to steel. Then he meets me. The next 3 days compressed time into something dense and airless. Every hour carried the weight of a decision that could not be reversed. Every piece of intelligence that arrived through Voss's network shifted the tactical landscape by degrees that were individually minor and cumulatively seismic. Day 1. Caedric's men intercepted a financial transfer between Ashfield's banking agent and an intermediary in Ashford. The amount was substantial enough to confirm operational intent and documented enough to serve as evidence. The agent was confronted. He was not a brave man. Brave men do not become banking intermediaries. He provided names, dates, and a written statement within 4 hours in exchange for the promise that his involvement would be characterized as coerced rather than voluntary. Day 2. The operative sent to Blackthorne reported that Ashworth had indeed repositioned the household guard. 12 of the Duke's 20 personal guards had been reassigned to estate perimeter duties, effectively removing them from the command structure. The remaining 8 answered to Ashworth's deputy, a former military officer named Crane, who had transferred his loyalty with the seamless professionalism of a man who served positions rather than people. However, the household staff below the guard level, The valets, the cooks, the stable hands, the invisible workforce that kept the keep functioning, remained loyal to the Duke in the way that working people remain loyal to the person who signs their wages rather than the person who manages their schedules. Renwick, the report confirmed, had not been turned. He was maintaining his position within the household, providing intelligence to the operative through a communication channel he had established independently within hours of Ashworth's takeover, because Renwick had served the Vale family for 23 years and understood, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had watched 2 generations of this family's self-destruction, which side of history he intended to stand on. Day 3. Voss reached the Lord Chancellor. The message he carried was not a plea, it was a detonation. A comprehensive dossier documenting Ashworth's conspiracy, supported by financial records, the banking agent's statement, intercepted correspondence, and a detailed analysis of the political implications that read like a prosecutor's opening argument because that was exactly what it was designed to become. The Lord Chancellor was a pragmatist. He evaluated the dossier not through the lens of justice, but through the lens of institutional stability. An assassination conspiracy involving 3 noble houses and a sitting duke's political steward was not merely a crime. It was a systemic infection. Left untreated, it would metastasize into a constitutional crisis. Exposed and prosecuted, it became a demonstration of institutional self-correction, the kind of decisive action that strengthened the system by proving it could identify and remove its own malignancies. He authorized an investigation within 6 hours. Warrants were issued for Ashworth, Harrington, and Ashfield before sunset. But warrants required time to execute. Couriers required roads required days. And the professional Ashworth had hired did not operate within the institutional timeline. He arrived in Greyhaven on the 3rd night. Caedric's perimeter men spotted the approach at 11 in the evening. 2 riders moving along the coastal track from the south, traveling without lanterns, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound against the rocky path. Professional technique, the kind of field craft that announced its practitioner's competence through the sophistication of its concealment. The warning reached St. Aurelia Hall 12 minutes before the riders reached the village. 12 minutes. The distance between preparation and catastrophe measured in a unit of time that most people waste checking pocket watches and adjusting cravats. 12 minutes to transform a medical facility into a defensive position. 12 minutes to move a pregnant woman from a ground floor room to an interior chamber with stone walls thick enough to stop a musket ball. 12 minutes to distribute weapons among 7 men who were intelligence operatives, not combat soldiers, and whose experience with direct violence was theoretical rather than habitual. Caedric armed himself with a cavalry saber he had carried from Blackthorne and a pistol he had purchased from a Dunmore fisherman who used it to signal boats in fog. He positioned 2 men at the hall's main entrance, 2 at the rear courtyard gate, 2 on the upper floor with a sight line to the coastal approach, and himself at the ground floor corridor that connected the treatment room to the interior chamber where Seraphina waited. The last position. The final barrier. The place where, if everything else failed, the geometry of the building reduced the situation to its most elemental form. 1 corridor, 1 man, 1 doorway. His hands were steady, his breathing was controlled, his heart rate had stabilized at the elevated but functional rhythm of a body that had processed the initial adrenaline surge and settled into the cold operational state that exists between fear and action. He was not afraid. Fear required uncertainty about the outcome, and Caedric was not uncertain. He knew exactly what he was willing to do. He knew exactly what it would cost. And he knew that the man standing in this corridor was not the man who had signed dissolution papers in a mahogany study 6 months ago, because that man had measured value in bloodlines and political capital and the abstract architecture of dynastic continuity. And this man measured value in the sound of breathing coming from the room behind him, where a woman he had wronged was protecting a child he did not deserve, with the same steady, grinding, unrewarded courage she had applied to everything since the day he had been too blind to recognize what he was losing. A man discovers what he is when the structure is gone, when the title is meaningless and the estate is compromised, and the political machinery has been hijacked, and the only thing remaining is a stone corridor and a blade, and the biological imperative to place his body between danger and the 2 people who have become, without his permission and against every principle he was raised to value, the only definition of worth that his mind will accept. The first rider reached the courtyard. Caedric heard the hooves on cobblestone, heard the creak of leather as the rider dismounted, heard the silence that followed as the man assessed the building, reading its architecture the way a predator reads terrain, identifying entry points and sightlines and the structural vulnerabilities that every building possesses, regardless of how thick its walls. Then glass shattered on the upper floor. The sound split the silence like a pistol shot. One of Caedric's men shouted. A scuffle erupted above, boots against stone, the heavy percussion of bodies colliding in a confined space. The second rider had entered through the upper windows while the first drew attention to the ground level. Classic infiltration. Divide the defense, split the focus, create chaos and move through it the way water moves through cracks. Caedric did not move from the corridor. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to respond, to run upstairs, to engage, to apply force to the immediate threat with the aggressive decisiveness that had defined his approach to every conflict in his 34 years. But the corridor was the position. The corridor was the geometry. And the man who moved from the geometry was the man who created the opening that the enemy was designed to exploit. He stayed. Above him, the fighting intensified. He heard steel on steel, heard someone fall heavily, heard a voice he recognized as one of his own men give a short, sharp cry that ended with the wet finality of a sound no one who has heard it ever forgets. Then footsteps on the stairs. Fast, descending. The rhythm was wrong for his men. Too controlled, too evenly spaced. The footsteps of someone who had eliminated the obstacle above and was now moving to the primary objective with the clinical efficiency of a professional executing a contract. Caedric raised the saber. The man appeared at the end of the corridor. Backlit by the faint glow from the stairwell, his silhouette was compact and balanced. He carried a short blade in his right hand and something that glinted like a second weapon in his left. His face was obscured by shadow, but his posture communicated everything language could not. Relaxed, centered. The posture of a man who had done this enough times that the physical mechanics had become as automatic as breathing. He stopped 10 feet from Caedric, evaluated, made calculations that happened behind eyes. Caedric could not see, but whose conclusions he could read in the micro-adjustments of the man's stance. "You are not the target," the man said. His voice was unremarkable. The accent was regional. Midlands. The tone carried no hostility, no aggression, no emotional investment of any kind. The voice of a man discussing logistics. "You will not reach her. I have a contract. And I have a corridor." The professional tilted his head, a gesture of assessment, measuring the distance between them, measuring the reach of Caedric's saber versus the optimal engagement range of his own shorter blades, measuring the width of the corridor and the position of the walls and the available angles of attack with the mathematical precision of a man for whom violence was architecture. "You are a duke," the man said. "Dukes do not die in hallways. This one does if necessary." Something shifted in the professional's stance, not hesitation, recalculation. The recognition that the variable standing between him and the target was not behaving according to the predictive model. Aristocrats threatened. They postured. They invoked authority and consequence and the institutional machinery of reprisal. They did not plant themselves in stone corridors with cavalry sabers and the visible intention to make the engagement physically expensive regardless of outcome. This was a different calculation, and the professional, whose entire livelihood depended on accurate calculation, recognized the difference. "The contract pays well," the man said, "but not well enough for this." "Then leave." "The people who hired me do not accept incomplete work." "The people who hired you will be in custody within the week. Warrants have been issued. The Lord Chancellor is involved. Your employers are finished. The only question remaining is whether you are finished with them or with me." Silence. The corridor held its breath. Somewhere behind the closed door at Caedric's back, Seraphina was listening to this exchange through 2 inches of oak and understanding, with the absolute clarity of a woman who had spent months diagnosing the distance between a man's words and his actual condition, that the man in the corridor was not negotiating. He was offering the professional a choice that the professional's employers had not anticipated. The choice between completing a contract for clients who would be arrested, imprisoned, and stripped of every resource that made their payment meaningful, or walking away from a corridor defended by a man whose willingness to die had fundamentally broken the economic model that assassination contracts depended upon. The professional's right hand adjusted its grip on the short blade. A millimeter. The smallest possible recalibration, the kind of movement that precedes either a strike or a surrender, and is indistinguishable from either until the moment commits. Then sounds erupted from the courtyard below. Hooves, voices, the sharp authoritative commands of men who arrive with institutional backing and the procedural confidence of warrants and writs, and the full organizational weight of a government that has decided to assert itself. Voss, ahead of schedule, Chetz. With reinforcements that had not been part of the original plan, because the Lord Chancellor, having read the dossier and recognized the severity, had dispatched a Crown detachment to Greyhaven with orders that superseded every local authority between the capital and the coast. The professional heard the commotion, read its implications, made a final calculation that lasted approximately 2 seconds and encompassed the complete economic and operational landscape of a contract that had just become worthless. He lowered the blade. "Your corridor," he said, and something in his voice carried the ghost of what might have been professional respect, one practitioner acknowledging another's commitment to a position held beyond rational cost-benefit analysis. He turned, walked back down the corridor, descended the stairs with the same controlled rhythm he had used ascending them, and disappeared into the chaos of the courtyard where Crown soldiers were securing the perimeter and Voss was shouting orders, and the machinery of institutional justice was grinding into motion with the slow, inevitable momentum of something that could not be stopped once it started. Caedric stood in the corridor for another 30 seconds. His saber was still raised, his breathing was still controlled, his body was still locked in the combat posture that it had assumed 12 minutes ago, and would not release until his nervous system received confirmation from sources deeper than conscious thought that the threat had passed. Then the door behind him opened. Seraphina stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, one hand on her stomach. Her face was pale, but composed, drawn tight with the particular stillness of a woman who has just listened to the man she once loved offer to die in a hallway for her and their unborn child, and is processing that information through systems that have no precedent for it. Caedric. His name. Just his name. The same way she had said it in the drawing room of Blackthorne Keep 6 months ago. Stripped bare. Offered without ornamentation. But the texture had changed. The word carried weight it had not carried before. The weight of a woman who had heard a man choose a corridor over a title and understood that the choice had not been strategic. His arm lowered. The saber's tip touched the stone floor with a sound like a bell being struck once, softly, at the end of a very long silence. He turned to face her, and in the candlelight of St. Aurelia Hall, with crowned soldiers securing the courtyard and the coastal wind howling through shattered upper windows, and the distant sound of waves breaking against the cliffs below with the same ancient, patient violence they had applied to that shoreline since before humans learned to build anything worth defending. The Duke of Blackthorne looked at the woman he had tried to erase and found that his vocabulary, which had served him through parliamentary debates and political warfare and 34 years of strategic communication, contained exactly 0 words adequate to the moment. So he said nothing. And she crossed the threshold, took the saber from his hand, set it against the wall, and pressed her forehead against his chest. They stood like that in the stone corridor while the world reorganized itself around them. 2 people, one heartbeat between them that neither could claim as exclusively their own. And outside, the storm that had been building on the western horizon for 3 days finally broke over Greyhaven with a fury that shook the foundations of the old monastery and sent rain hammering against every surface with the sound of something being washed clean, whether it was ready or not. The storm lasted 14 hours. By the time it broke, the courtyard of St. Aurelia Hall looked like a battlefield that had been fought over by the weather itself. Fallen branches, overturned supply crates, puddles of brown water pooling in the cracks between cobblestones. 2 of the upper windows were shattered beyond salvage, and the east wall had taken enough wind damage to expose a section of original medieval stonework that had been hidden behind plaster for 3 centuries, as if the building were revealing older, harder versions of itself in response to the violence it had absorbed. Crown soldiers occupied the perimeter, 7 of them, deployed by the Lord Chancellor's warrant, wearing the dark blue uniforms of the Judicial Enforcement Division and carrying the particular expression of men who have been sent a long distance on short notice and are professionally committed to completing the assignment regardless of personal opinion about its merits. Their commanding officer, a captain named Heir, with no relation to Margaret, established a temporary post in the hall's ground floor storage room and began documenting the events of the previous night with the methodical patience of a man who understood that paperwork was the mechanism by which violence became history. Caedric provided his account standing. He had not slept. The saber cut along his left forearm, sustained when the second attacker had breached the upper floor and engaged 2 of his men before being subdued, had been cleaned and bound by Seraphina with the same clinical efficiency she applied to every wound that came through her treatment room. She had not spoken while she worked, had not looked at his face, had focused entirely on the laceration, the depth of the tissue damage, the alignment of the wound edges, the tension of the bandage. Professional attention. The kind of attention that simultaneously conveyed care and deferred every emotional conversation to a time when the body's immediate needs had been addressed. He understood the deferral. He respected it. He was, in fact, grateful for it, because the alternative was a conversation he did not yet have the vocabulary to conduct. The professional assassin had vanished. Caedric's perimeter men reported that he had exited the courtyard during the initial confusion of the Crown soldiers' arrival, moved along the cliff path south, and disappeared into the storm with the practiced invisibility of a man whose professional survival depended on the ability to become nobody at a moment's notice. He left behind 1 dead operative on the upper floor of the hall, a man who carried no identification and whose face matched no records in Voss's intelligence archives, a ghost employed by ghosts now permanently removed from the ledger. One of Caedric's own men was dead. William Mercer, 31 years old, former military intelligence, recruited into the Duke's network 4 years ago, killed by a blade wound to the throat sustained during the upper floor engagement. He died in a corridor of a converted monastery 300 miles from his home, defending a woman he had never met, on the orders of a man whose authority had been functionally dismantled by the very institution Mercer had served. Caedric stood over the body before it was removed, looked at the face, memorized it, not as a gesture of sentiment, as an act of accounting. This man's death was an entry in a ledger that Caedric had created through 34 years of decisions that prioritized systems over people, and the balance of that ledger was something he would carry in his body for the rest of his life. Not as guilt, because guilt was a performance, but as weight, the kind of weight that changes the way a man walks through rooms and makes decisions and measures the distance between what a thing costs and what a thing is worth. He did not apologize to the body. Apology required an audience, and the dead do not constitute an audience. He simply stood, looked, absorbed the cost, and carried it forward into the next hour. The warrants reached Blackthorne Keep on a Thursday morning. Ashworth was arrested in the Duke's own study, seated behind the Duke's own desk, reviewing correspondence with the administrative composure of a man who had fully inhabited the authority vacuum left by Caedric's departure and was operating the duchy's political machinery as if the transfer of power were already complete. The arrest was conducted by 4 Crown officers who entered the study without announcement and presented the warrant with the procedural formality that the judicial system applied to high-ranking targets. Ashworth read the document completely. Then he folded it, placed it on the desk, and looked at the officers with the pale blue gaze of a man who had spent 40 years calculating odds and had just encountered a result that fell outside his probability model. "The timing," he said. "I miscalculated the timing." Not a confession, an autopsy. A man reviewing the mechanical failure that had caused his machine to break, more interested in the engineering than the consequence. He did not ask about Caedric, did not ask about Seraphina, did not perform any version of remorse or justification or the emotional theater that lesser men deploy when the system closes around them. He simply identified the variable he had gotten wrong and noted it with the clinical detachment of a professional who viewed his own destruction as a case study rather than a tragedy. Harrington's arrest was louder. He protested, invoked his family's 300-year relationship with the Crown, demanded audiences with officials who were themselves being questioned about their proximity to the conspiracy. His wife fainted. His daughter Eleanor, the woman who had been positioned as Caedric's second wife, stood in the drawing room of Harrington House and watched Crown officers remove her father's papers with the still, unblinking expression of a woman who had just understood that the future she had been constructed to inhabit no longer existed. Ashfield attempted to flee. He made it 17 miles before a Crown patrol intercepted his carriage on the Ashford Road. The discovery of £30,000 in negotiable securities hidden beneath the carriage seat confirmed everything the dossier had alleged and added several additional charges that the Lord Chancellor had not originally anticipated. The conspiracy collapsed not with a dramatic final confrontation, but with the bureaucratic inevitability of a system processing its own corruption. Hearings were scheduled. Assets were frozen. Titles were suspended pending judicial review. The aristocratic machine that had operated for centuries on the assumption of mutual protection among its members was forced to demonstrate that it could also consume its own when the cost of protection exceeded the cost of prosecution. Caedric received the reports in Greyhaven. Voss delivered them personally, arriving at St. Aurelia Hall on horseback with a leather satchel of documents that summarized, in the dry procedural language of governmental correspondence, the complete dismantlement of the power structure that Caedric had spent his adult life building. He read them in the treatment room, alone. The candles had been replaced since the attack, and the new ones burned with a steadier flame that threw fewer shadows, making the room feel smaller and more honest than it had during the siege. Ashworth's estate had been seized. The political alliances that formed the backbone of the Blackthorne power network were severed or compromised. The household guard had been disbanded pending reconstitution under Crown oversight. The duchy itself remained legally intact, held in trust by the judicial system until Caedric could formally resume authority. But the infrastructure that had made the duchy functional, the web of relationships and obligations and strategic dependencies that converted a title into actual power, was gone. He had left Blackthorne as a duke with the most sophisticated political machine in the northern territories. He would return as a duke with a title, a damaged estate, and the requirement to rebuild every alliance from the foundation upward. The old Caedric would have calculated this as a catastrophic loss. The old Caedric measured worth in structural terms, networks, influence, the number of men who answered when summoned, and the speed with which they complied. By that measurement, the events of the past 2 weeks had reduced him from the most powerful aristocrat in the north to a man sitting in a converted monastery reading about his own institutional disembowelment by candlelight. But the old Caedric had also built a machine that tried to kill his wife and his unborn child. And the measurement system that produced that machine was the measurement system that needed to die. He set the reports on the table, stared at them for a long time. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the harbor where the fishing boats were returning from the morning's work, their hulls low in the water with the weight of the catch, their crews moving with the unselfconscious coordination of people who measured success in immediate, tangible, unabstract terms. Fish in the hold, boat still floating. Everyone came home. There was a simplicity in that economy that his entire education had trained him to dismiss as primitive. He was beginning to understand that the dismissal had been the primitive thing. Seraphina found him at the window. She had been treating patients in the village since dawn, returning to the hall only to resupply her satchel. Her sleeves were rolled, her hair was tied back with a length of twine that had replaced the silk ribbons of her former life, with the same unsentimental functionality that characterized everything in Greyhaven. She looked tired. She looked real. She looked like a woman who had been awake since 5 a.m. doing work that mattered and was not interested in pretending otherwise. "The reports," she said. "Ashworth is in custody. Harrington and Ashfield as well. And Blackthorne? Damaged, functional, requiring reconstruction." She leaned against the door frame, studied him with the diagnostic gaze that he had learned to recognize as her equivalent of his own analytical process. She was reading him, not his words, his posture, the set of his shoulders, the way his hand rested against the windowsill with a looseness that would have been impossible 3 weeks ago, when every muscle in his body existed in a state of perpetual readiness that he had mistaken for strength and now recognized as chronic tension. "You are afraid," she said. Not a question. A diagnosis. Yes? Of what? Of going back and becoming what I was. The honesty came easier now. Not easy. Easier. The difference between hauling a boulder uphill and hauling it across level ground. The weight had not changed. The terrain had. Seraphina crossed the room, stood beside him at the window, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body through the space between them, a distance of inches that contained the entire history of their marriage, the silence and the absence and the contractual coldness and the slow, agonizing reconstruction that was happening now, not through dramatic revelation, but through the accumulated evidence of daily presence. "You will go back," she said, "because the duchy is not just a machine. It is 300,000 people whose taxes fund schools and roads and market regulation. It is tenant farmers whose leases depend on a functional estate authority. It is a judicial system that requires oversight and a trade network that employs 6,000 workers and a medical infrastructure that currently does not exist and should." "You sound like a duchess." "I sound like a woman who spent 5 months treating people who suffer because the aristocratic system that is supposed to serve them is too busy serving itself. The system needs to change, and you are the only person with both the authority to change it and the recent personal experience of what happens when it operates without accountability." "That is a generous interpretation of my recent personal experience. It is an accurate interpretation. You built a machine that almost killed me. You also dismantled it at enormous personal cost when you understood what it had become. Both of those facts are true simultaneously. The question is not which one defines you. The question is which one you choose to build from." Caedric turned from the window, looked at her, not with the flat analytical gaze of the Duke conducting an assessment, with the raw, unguarded attention of a man who had been stripped down to his foundational architecture and was seeing, perhaps for the first time, the person standing in front of him with enough clarity to understand what he was looking at. "I cannot do it alone," he said. "You never could. You simply did not know that. I am asking you to come back to Blackthorne. I know what you are asking." "And?" Seraphina placed both hands on her stomach. The baby had been active all morning, responding to its mother's movement and heartbeat with the blind, insistent vitality of a body that did not yet know it had almost been killed and would not have understood the concept if it had. Life at that stage was pure momentum, cellular commitment to continuation regardless of external circumstance. "I will not go back to the drawing room," she said. "I will not stand by cathedral windows in pale gray and wait for you to remember that I exist. I will not be a function in your administrative structure or a portrait on your gallery wall or a name on a contractual document that reduces our marriage to a series of obligations measured in air production and public appearances." "I understand." "Do you?" "Because the man I married would have heard those conditions as a negotiation, and I am not negotiating. I hear them as requirements. Requirements you are willing to meet. Requirements I have no right to refuse." She held his gaze for a long time, reading, diagnosing, running the assessment through the clinical machinery she had built during 5 months of treating wounds and delivering babies and mixing medicines in a building that the aristocratic world had forgotten, using skills that the aristocratic world did not value, for people that the aristocratic world did not see. "Greyhaven needs a medical academy," she said. "Yes. Funded by the duchy, not by charity, by structural allocation, permanent, accountable, built into the estate's operating budget with the same priority as military expenditure and parliamentary representation." "Yes, and I will run it. I would not trust anyone else." "You should not trust anyone at all. Trust is what Ashworth exploited. What you should build instead is accountability. Systems that function because they are transparent, not because the people operating them happen to be loyal at the moment." Caedric almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. It was the muscular precursor to a smile, the facial equivalent of a foundation being laid for a structure that did not yet exist, but whose architectural plans had been approved. "When did you become a political strategist?" "When my husband threw me out of his house and I had to rebuild my entire existence from scratch in a fishing village with 12 pounds and a first trimester pregnancy. Survival is a comprehensive education. The return to Blackthorne took 2 weeks, not because the journey required it, because the preparation required it. Caedric sent Voss ahead to coordinate with the Crown's oversight team and begin the process of institutional reconstruction. He dispatched letters to the 7 remaining allied families whose involvement in the conspiracy had been tangential or non-existent, establishing the groundwork for a new alliance structure built on transparency rather than obligation. He arranged for the transport of Seraphina's medical inventory, her library of reconstructed treatment journals, and the equipment she had accumulated through 5 months of coastal practice. And he buried William Mercer in the Dunmore Cemetery overlooking the harbor, in a plot purchased from the village council with the full acknowledgement that the man lying in the ground had died in service to a cause that the Duke had not deserved at the time, and was spending the rest of his life trying to earn retroactively. There was no ceremony, no speech, a stone marker with a name and 2 dates, and the silence of a coastal wind that did not differentiate between the graves of dukes and the graves of operatives. Margaret Hale stood at the cemetery gate as they left. She had not been invited. She had not asked permission. She simply stood there, as she stood everywhere, with the solid, unargumentable presence of a woman who had earned her position in the world through endurance rather than title. "You will take care of her," Margaret said. Not to Caedric, to the air between them, to the assumption that he was listening. "Yes. That is not a promise I am requesting. It is a condition I am imposing. If she comes back damaged, I will know. And I am not a woman who forgives efficiently." Caedric looked at the tavern keeper who had given Seraphina a room above a kitchen and asked no questions, and provided the kind of unadorned, unperformative care that the aristocratic world buried under ritual and obligation until the care itself was invisible. Margaret had done more for his wife in 5 months than he had done in 3 years. That fact sat in his chest like a stone he could not swallow and could not spit out and would carry until it dissolved, which might be never. "I understand," he said. "You are beginning to. That is not the same thing, but it is enough for now." She turned and walked back toward the tavern without looking back. The wind pulled at her shawl. The harbor bells clanged in the distance, and the village of Dunmore continued its relentless, unsentimental business of existing without any particular regard for the Duke who was leaving or the woman he was taking with him. Seraphina rode beside him in the carriage, not across from him, beside him. The distinction mattered in ways that neither of them articulated but both understood. Across was formal. Across was the spatial arrangement of people maintaining distance within shared space. Beside was proximity. Risk. The physical acknowledgement that the distance between 2 bodies is a choice, and that the choice, once made, changes the architecture of everything that follows. She slept for the first 3 hours of the journey, her head against his shoulder, her hand resting on her stomach where the baby shifted and turned with the restless energy of a body preparing to enter a world it could not yet see. Caedric sat motionless, breathing carefully, unwilling to disturb the weight against his shoulder, because the weight was the most valuable thing he had ever been trusted with, and he was not yet confident in his ability to carry it without causing damage. The carriage rolled north through spring landscapes that were aggressively, almost obscenely alive. Green fields, blooming hedgerows, rivers swollen with snowmelt running through valleys that looked like they had been designed by painters who did not believe in subtlety. The world was renewing itself with the biological indifference of a system that did not care about politics or dynasties or the internal struggles of men who had spent their lives trying to control processes that predated their species by several billion years. Caedric watched the landscape pass and thought about his father. The old Duke. The man who had backhanded an 11-year-old boy for crying in a courtyard and thereby established the foundational principle of an entire life. Sentiment is weakness. Control is survival. The world is a mechanism. Maintain the mechanism. The old Duke had been wrong. Not because sentiment was strength. Sentiment was, in fact, dangerous. Vulnerability was, in fact, costly. Caring about another person did, in fact, create structural weaknesses in a man's psychological architecture that could be exploited by anyone with sufficient intelligence and insufficient conscience. But the alternative was Ashworth. The alternative was a machine that optimized for efficiency until the efficiency consumed the people it was supposed to serve. The alternative was a life measured in dispatches and brandy consumption and the slow, invisible process of a man calcifying from the inside until the only thing left was function without purpose, motion without direction, power without any definition of what the power was for. His father had died at 51, cardiac failure. The official cause was medical. The actual cause was architectural. A life built entirely on control will eventually collapse under its own structural load, because control is compression, and compression, applied long enough, crushes the thing it was designed to protect. Caedric was 34. He had 17 years before he reached the age at which his father's architecture had failed. 17 years to build something different, something that incorporated the efficiency his training had provided while replacing the foundational assumption that had made that efficiency toxic. People are not mechanisms. Trust is not a liability. Vulnerability is not weakness, but the price of admission to the only experiences that make power worth having. He did not know if he believed those statements yet. Belief was a structure, and structures took time, but he understood them. And understanding was the foundation on which belief could eventually be built. Blackthorne Keep appeared on the horizon at sunset on the 7th day. The fortress rose from the northern moors like something that had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it, its stone towers catching the last light of day and holding it in their surfaces the way old buildings hold the memory of everyone who has lived within them. The keep looked the same as it had the morning Caedric rode south, the same stone, the same parapets, the same cathedral windows in the western wing where Seraphina had stood for 3 years watching rain. But the man approaching it was not the same man who had left, and the woman beside him was not the same woman who had been sent away, and the child between them, still weeks from birth, still assembling itself in the darkness of the womb with the patient, relentless commitment of biology pursuing its own agenda, was the physical embodiment of a future that neither of them had planned, and both of them were willing to defend at costs that would have been incomprehensible to the people they had been 6 months ago. The household staff lined the courtyard. Renwick stood at the front. His face betrayed nothing, as always, but his hands, clasped behind his back in the formal posture he adopted for occasions of institutional significance, were trembling. A vibration so slight that only someone who had spent 23 years in close proximity to this man would have detected it. Caedric detected it. He descended from the carriage first, offered his hand to Seraphina. She took it, stepped down onto the cobblestones of Blackthorne Keep with the steady, unperformative grace of a woman who had learned to walk on wet stone and muddy tracks and hospital floors slick with things she preferred not to catalog, and who was not going to be intimidated by a courtyard she had crossed 1,000 times in a previous life that felt now like something that had happened to someone else. Renwick bowed. "Welcome home, Your Grace." The plural, addressing both of them. A grammatical choice that communicated, in the compressed language of household protocol, that the valet had already classified this return as a restoration of the original order, adjusted for the changes that the intervening months had produced. Caedric looked at his valet, at the trembling hands, at the face that betrayed nothing, and the eyes that betrayed everything. 23 years. This man had watched the previous Duke destroy himself, had watched Caedric begin the same process, and had stayed. Not because he was paid to stay, because the staying was the point. Because loyalty, real loyalty, the kind that Ashworth had never understood and never could, was not an economic arrangement but a form of witness, the commitment to being present while another person figures out whether they are going to survive their own choices. "Thank you, Renwick," Caedric said, and the 2 words carried more weight than any parliamentary address he had ever delivered, because they were not strategic, and they were not performative, and they cost him something to say, and the cost was the thing that made them true. The eastern gallery wall had not been repainted a 3rd time. The rectangular outline where Seraphina's portrait had hung was still visible, a ghost of absence preserved in the differential fading of old plaster. Caedric had ordered it painted over, twice, and twice the paint had failed to fully conceal what had been removed. He did not order a 3rd attempt. Instead, he commissioned a new portrait, not the formal, posed, aristocratically conventional portrait that had hung there before, depicting a duchess in ceremonial dress with the standardized expression of institutional composure that aristocratic painters applied to all their subjects, regardless of the actual person underneath. The new portrait was painted in Greyhaven. Seraphina standing on the harbor steps of Dunmore, her hair loose, her sleeves rolled, her hands carrying the faint staining of herbal preparation that never fully washed out. Behind her, the fishing boats and the stone cottages, and the cliffs of black shale dropping into the Atlantic. Around her, the wind and the light and the salt air of a place that had stripped her down to her actual self, and found that the actual self was more than sufficient. It hung in the Eastern Gallery on a Tuesday in June. Seraphina stood in front of it for a long time, her hand on her stomach, which was now large enough to make the gesture less protective and more structural, a way of managing the shifting weight of a body in its final weeks of shared occupancy. "It does not look like a duchess," she said. "No," Caedric said. He stood beside her, close. The proximity that had begun in a carriage and had continued through every room and corridor of Blackthorne since their return. The physical closeness of a man who had learned that distance was not safety but habit, and that habits could be broken if the motivation was sufficient. "It looks like you." Their son was born on a morning in July when the sky above Blackthorne was the precise blue of something that has been cleaned by weeks of summer rain and is now presenting its best version without apology. The birth took 11 hours. Seraphina labored in the chambers she had chosen herself. Not the formal birthing suite that tradition prescribed, but a room on the second floor with windows facing south, where the light was warm and the view extended beyond the estate walls to the rolling green countryside that stretched toward the horizon, like a promise that the world was larger than any building could contain. Caedric was present. Not in the corridor, not in the study waiting for a report, in the room, beside the bed. Holding her hand with a grip that she later told him had been too tight, and that she had not asked him to loosen because the tightness was the most honest thing he had ever communicated, and she was not going to interrupt honesty with comfort. The boy was healthy, 7 pounds, dark hair, eyes that would eventually settle into the gray of the Vale bloodline, but were, at birth, the indeterminate blue-gray of all new humans, a color that had not yet committed to a final version of itself. He screamed when he entered the world, which the attending physician said was normal, and which Caedric interpreted as a reasonable response to the available data. He held his son for the first time standing beside the open window, the summer air carrying the smell of cut grass and warm stone, and the faint, distant scent of rain building somewhere beyond the moors. The baby weighed almost nothing, a few pounds of biological potential, unformed and undetermined and containing, in its tiny, clenched fists and its furious, red-faced cry, every possible version of a future that had not yet been written. Caedric looked at the child and understood, with a clarity that bypassed his intellect entirely and registered instead in the deeper, older systems that operated below conscious thought, that the man holding this baby was not the man who had signed dissolution papers in this house 7 months ago. That man was dead, not dramatically, not through some cinematic moment of transformation. He had died the way most internal versions of a person die, slowly, through accumulated evidence, through the grinding daily process of being confronted with reality until the fictional version of the self that had been maintained through willpower and denial simply could not sustain itself against the weight of what was actually true. What was actually true was small and heavy and screaming in his arms. What was actually true was the woman in the bed behind him, exhausted and sweat-soaked, and watching him hold their son with an expression that was not soft, because Seraphina had moved beyond softness into something more durable, but was open in a way that her face had not been open in Blackthorne before. The openness of a woman who had decided that the risk of being seen was preferable to the safety of being invisible. What was actually true was that the Duke of Blackthorne, who had once measured worth in political capital and bloodline purity and the number of lesser men who flinched when he entered a room, was standing at a window holding a baby and discovering that the capacity to be fundamentally changed by another person was not the vulnerability his father had warned him about. It was the point. Years later, the Northern Territories still spoke of Duke Caedric Vale with the careful respect that powerful men generate in the communities they govern. The duchy was rebuilt, not restored. Rebuilt. The distinction mattered. Restoration would have meant returning to the previous architecture with cosmetic adjustments. Rebuilding meant new foundations. transparent financial systems, accountable governance structures, a political alliance network based on documented mutual obligation rather than the unwritten exchange of favors that had made Ashworth's betrayal possible. The Greyhaven Medical Academy opened in the autumn of the following year, funded by permanent ducal allocation, staffed by physicians recruited from university programs across the country, and directed by a woman whose formal credentials consisted of 5 months of self-taught coastal medicine and a survival instinct that no university could replicate. It served 6 coastal provinces. It trained 40 physicians in its first 3 years, and it reduced infant mortality in the Greyhaven region by a percentage that the National Health Ministry described as statistically remarkable and that Seraphina described as insufficient, because insufficiency was the engine that kept her working, and she was not interested in running out of fuel. Blackthorne Keep itself changed, not structurally. The stone walls and the cathedral windows and the mahogany study remained as they had been for generations. But the silence changed. The old silence had been the silence of absence, the silence of rooms designed to contain power and not people, the silence that develops in houses where emotional expression has been categorized as weakness, and the only permissible sound is the efficient transaction of institutional business. The new silence was different. It was the silence between a man and a woman sitting in the same room reading different books, each aware of the other's breathing, each comfortable enough with the other's presence to let the quiet exist without filling it with performance. It was the silence of a child sleeping in a nursery 1 floor above while his parents occupied the study below, connected by the invisible thread of parental awareness that operates below the frequency of conscious thought. It was the silence of a house that had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to contain actual life rather than merely the administration of it. Caedric still governed with the decisive authority that his position required. He was not gentle. He was not soft. The political landscape of the Northern Territories did not reward gentleness, and the families who had survived the Ashworth Purge understood that the Duke who had rebuilt the duchy from its foundations was no less formidable than the Duke who had built the original machine. More formidable, in fact. Because a man who has been betrayed by his own system and survived the betrayal and reconstructed the system from scratch possesses a kind of knowledge that cannot be acquired through inheritance or education. He knows where the vulnerabilities are. He knows because he has been inside them. But inside Blackthorne, behind the closed doors and the stone walls and the institutional facade that aristocratic life required, there existed a version of Caedric Vale that the political world never saw. The version that sat on the nursery floor with his son and built towers from wooden blocks, with the focused attention of a man who had once built empires from political alliances, and had discovered that the blocks were more satisfying because the only consequence of their collapse was the laughter of a child who wanted to watch them fall so they could be built again. The version that stood beside Seraphina in the Eastern Gallery and looked at the portrait of a woman on a harbor step and understood, every time he looked at it, that the most important thing he had ever done was not a parliamentary victory or a territorial acquisition or a political maneuver, but the decision to stand in a stone corridor with a cavalry saber and wait for whatever came. The version that walked the moors at dawn, alone, breathing the cold northern air, and carried inside his chest the knowledge that he had been given a second chance by a woman who had no obligation to give it, and a world that had no reason to offer it, and that the only appropriate response to that knowledge was to spend the rest of his life building something that deserved the chance it had been given. Travelers crossing the Northern Territories in the years that followed still spoke of Duke Caedric Vale with caution. He remained formidable in political warfare, uncompromising in governance, the kind of man whose name, mentioned in the wrong conversation, could rearrange the atmospheric pressure in a room. But the travelers who passed through Greyhaven told a different story. They spoke of a medical academy on the cliffs above the harbor, where physicians were trained to treat the people that the aristocratic system had spent centuries ignoring. They spoke of a duchess who ran the academy with the blunt, unperformative competence of a woman who had learned medicine in a fishing village and carried that education like a weapon she would never put down. They spoke of a duke who visited the coast 4 times a year and walked the harbor of Dunmore without escort, without ceremony, without any of the institutional performance that his title entitled him to, because the village did not care about his title, and he had learned at great cost that the things which did not care about his title were the things most worth caring about. And in the eastern gallery of Blackthorne Keep, a portrait hung on a wall that had been painted over twice and still carried, beneath the fresh surface, the faint rectangular outline of something that had been removed. The outline was visible only in certain light, at certain angles, to people who knew what they were looking for. Caedric never had it repainted again. The mark on the wall was not a flaw. It was a record. The evidence that something had been taken away and something else had been put in its place, and that the difference between the two was the entire distance between the man he had been and the man he had become. The wall remembered. And so did he.